Hello, this is James, and I'd like to welcome you back to the final episode of the Mercury Program of Real World Rockets. This is going to be Real World Rockets Episode 6, and this is going to be the last Mercury mission, just like the way they did it, in the 60s. One thing I wanted to show you quickly here before we get started is I actually have a nice American flag set up. I think it looks nice. This isn't Cape Canaveral, and that certainly isn't our astronaut, but, or Gordon Cooper. I was blanking on his name, and I realized I couldn't really do that with the whole episode. So yeah, that's not really Gordon Cooper, but it's kind of a nice touch, so there we have it. Alright, without further ado, let's start our launch in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, liftoff. We're getting a little bit more lag because I'm actually looking at the ground. Okay. There. Now the video should smooth out. Good. The camera on. Nice look. There we go. Alright, so this is Mercury-Atlas 9. The spacecraft's name is Faith 7. And the astronaut is Gordon Cooper. This is the last last mission of the first American manned space program, the Mercury Program. This was intended to be a mission which was going to last a full day in orbit because it was designed to equal the Russian Vostok program. We are getting a little bit up there in velocity, but that's okay. We're just keeping an eye on things. Okay. Every mission after Vostok 1, which was Yuri Gagarin's flight, every flight after that was in orbit for more than a day, I believe. And so the Mercury program, which had, up until this point, only managed to spend 7 orbits in space, had only managed to achieve 7 orbits, was going to try and equal that program, so we could be the equals of the Soviets. Another thing is, that was one of the main ideas, or one of the main mission goals, or program goals, I should say, behind Project Mercury, was to spend the whole day in orbit, and so we could see if we could do that. There was originally going to be another flight, another Mercury flight after this one. I'm going to check our map view, see how we're doing. Okay. And lag. Okay. This was originally going to be the second to last flight of the Mercury program, with a 3-day, 48-orbit mission planned, which would have been flown by none other than Alan Shepard, the first American in space. But that was later decided against, because they were interested, they meaning NASA, NASA was interested in moving on to the more ambitious Project Mercury. And frankly, who can blame them? Project Mercury is kind of or not Project Mercury, Project Gemini. Okay, coming up on staging here, 2 minutes, 14 seconds in this flight. Get rid of the escape tower, and we'll dump our booster engines. Okay. That's actually right on the mark, too, which is good for this flight. I'm going to go and see how we're doing for Apo. Okay. Okay. Good. Everything seems to be working properly. Good. Yes, there was originally going to be another flight, which would have been kind of interesting because, Alan Shepard didn't fly again for several years. But NASA decided against that because they wanted to move on to Gemini. And we're going to move on to Gemini very quickly here as well, but we're going to do something in between, which will be more important later. That was kind of cryptic, but you'll see what I mean. We're going to push our apoapsis up above 170 again so we can avoid the lag. We should have cut off our booster engine by now, but we're not in orbit, so that's okay. Or, no, that's not what it was. Cabin pressurized right about now. 5.5 psi was the internal cabin pressure during the Mercury flights. And so the cabin would have sealed off, of course, much lower in the atmosphere, because if it had sealed off for us, that would have been kind of bad, 0 psi. Probably not the best thing. Alright. While we're coasting to apoapsis, let's talk a bit about the rest of the video series. Since we're getting up here, this is a 21 orbit flight. We're going to move away from the hyper accurate orbital transcriptions. I've been flying the right number of orbits in each flight. We're going to move away from that now, because I don't think you guys want to watch 21 orbits in real time, nor would it really be that much fun for me to just, speed boost through them. So what we're going to do now in the program is we're going to start focusing on the scientific attributes of the flights, the notable achievements. This is going to be a bigger deal in Apollo, because the early Gemini flights are very similar to the Mercury flights. For our purposes, it's really just a capsule in orbit. But once we get to the Apollo missions, we'll be actually doing a bunch of new things, which will be fun to see. But we still have 12 Gemini missions plus a few others to cover before then. So we are just going to talk about the notable scientific aspects instead of spending 21 orbits in space. Okay, this coasting is taking a while, so let's actually move along. I don't know if this is accurate. I don't know if they had 2 burns. I know the Apollo programs didn't. They just burned they had a single gigantic burn from pad to orbit, I think. And then, of course, they burned again to launch to the moon. But that's the way we're going to do it in KSP, because that's the way I've been doing it in the series so far, and why mess with something that works? That's exactly what they did. The engineers at NASA did on this mission, though. The spacecraft was actually modified. They modified 4 of the Mercury spacecraft. I don't remember the spacecraft numbers, but they were like 6, 9, 10, and 12 or something, for day-long space operations. This included a redundant set of thrusters. They added some comfort stuff for the astronaut, including a new, human waste disposal system, which would have been appreciated in Alan Shepard's flight. And that's all we're going to say about that. Okay, we can look at the planet. It just kind of does, I guess. Alright, let's see how we're doing. 40 seconds out. Okay. So, what we're probably going to do is we're probably going to spend an orbit or two just talking about the actual flight here of Mercury-Atlas 9, Faith 7, whatever you want to call it. And then we'll splash down and we'll move on to the, and I think, more interesting Gemini program. But, yeah, we aren't going to be able to simulate any of Gordon Cooper's scientific experiments, unfortunately, just because, the parts and programming don't exist. Oh, I'm a little bit drifting off axis here. Let's call that good. Fire up. Leg. Right at Apo. How do you like that? I know you're supposed to kind of push your apoapsis, but I know we can get into orbit with this ship. I'm not too concerned about whether it's perfectly circular. I just want it above 159 to avoid our ever-present lag spikes. Okay. High off. X. Watching his booster stage float away. So that's kind of interesting. He spent a lot of his orbit doing things we can't simulate, or a lot of his time in space doing things we can't simulate. So we'll just talk a little bit about what he did and why it was important. Okay, he received his orbital information fairly early in the flight, actually. He knew he was going to be good for at least 7 orbits by the time he passed over Zanzibar, and that was later revised upward. Obviously, he didn't deorbit after 7 orbits. Boy, the lag is really bad. I might record this episode again, but, I might not. And you guys might just be able to listen to my fascinating commentary. Oh, look, there's the moon. See it over here? It's kind of nice that I have a mouse visible on screen. A lot of guys in YouTube or on YouTube, I should say. Guys and girls, of course, often say they point at the screen to show things, but I can actually do it. Look, there's the moon. Okay, enough rambling. Gordon Cooper spent his time doing a lot of scientific experiments. One of them was, by the time he got to his third orbit, he released a flashing probe, I guess you could say. He said he heard and felt it detach from the spacecraft. So I don't know what that means. I don't know where he carried it, but they detached it and they had some xenon strobe lights on it which flashed. And they asked him if he could, if he could track it, whether he could see it. They wanted to know how visible things were in orbit. He didn't see it on the third orbit, but I think it caught up with him on the fourth orbit. And he said to his Capcom, the little rascal was with me all night. It was very nearby, of course, it's not going to move much in relation to the spacecraft. And so he saw it again on his fifth and sixth orbits. That's a little annoying. Let's get rid of that person. There, little tiny boost that should put us far away eventually. Okay. Another scientific experiment Gordo performed on this flight was or rather attempted to perform, was he tried to release a balloon which was tethered to the front of the spacecraft. This balloon was painted orange so the astronaut could see it, but more importantly, it was designed to measure the drag, the difference in drag between apogee and perigee in the flight. And yes, I can use those terms because we're talking about Earth, not Kerbal, Earth. And so the balloon actually failed to deploy. He tried several times to deploy it, but it never worked, and so he eventually aborted the attempt, which is too bad. Earth's atmosphere, unlike Kerbin's, doesn't just end. You could say the moon is affected by Earth's atmosphere, though that's not really accurate. I mean, it's technically true, but Earth's atmosphere trails off as compared to ending. I mean, that makes sense. The atmosphere is just a group of particles attracted to the Earth by gravity. And so it becomes less and less the higher you go up. The oldest orbiting satellite, Vanguard 1, which is still up there, that's, I believe, the first successful American satellite, or no, that's actually not true, but it's one of the first successful American satellites. I think it's the second one. It's also the fourth satellite ever put in orbit after Sputnik 1 and 2 and Explorer 1, which was the first American satellite. Vanguard 1 has a perigee of like 655 kilometers or something, which is crazy. But even that is going to eventually decay. So even though that's the closest it gets to the Earth, it's still going to decay and fall into the atmosphere. But because it's a sphere, which, we know a lot about mathematically. Oh, that was bad. Which we know a lot about mathematically. Scientists can use the data, the lag in the orbit timing to determine, atmosphere drag on the satellite. So Gordo was supposed to do something similar, but it failed, unfortunately. I'm going to move a little more gently this time. Yeah, that's better. Okay. So aside from that, Gordo did spend some time in orbit. I'm going to accelerate a little bit, just so we don't just do one orbit. We're just going to fly around. Gordo did spend some time in orbit photographing things. Some of the best, well, I think most of the best photographs we have from the Mercury program are actually from this flight. I mean, he had the most opportunity to take photos, obviously, but it was also later. This flight flew it was more than 2 years after the first flight in the Mercury program, which was Alan Shepard's space shot. So they had, slightly better cameras and all that. Hello, KSC. Goodbye, KSC. But they knew what they were photographing too. And so, although some of his photographs were found to be overexposed later, um, we still did get a lot of good photographs from that flight. And he took, in particular, some detailed photographs of the Himalayas and Nepal. So we had some interesting photographs of Everest, Mount Everest, for example. Gordon Cooper also said that he could see things as detailed as roads, houses, when the lighting conditions were right. That wasn't believed to be true at the time. I mean, I don't think anybody thought he was lying, but it was believed to be. Um, it wasn't thought that astronauts could see that much from orbit. The astronauts from Gemini, as pronounced it both ways in the series, and I don't really know which is correct. The astronauts from later in the program did prove that correct. They could actually see individual houses when the lighting was right. Oh, that reminds me, this isn't actually something directly relating to Mercury, but it's an interesting. I mean, everybody's going to know what I'm talking about. Now, people say you can see the Great Wall of China from orbit. Not only that, they say you can see, or it's the only man-made object of the Great Wall, or it's the only man-made object you can see from space with the naked eye. And secondly, people have said that the astronauts on the moon could see the Great Wall of China from the moon. Now, first of all, that's ridiculous. The astronauts could. The Earth was not that big. I guess I don't really know how else to say that. The Earth was not large enough in the field of view to have that kind of clarity on the surface. But Chris Hadfield, who is a Canadian astronaut who just returned from the space station, he spent something like 6 months in orbit, and he did a very famous YouTube series which ended with him singing a rendition of David Bowie's Space Odyssey. It's pretty cool, go check it out. He did say that no, you cannot see the Great Wall of China from orbit with the naked eye. There were some pictures taken in 2004 from a U.S. shuttle mission, which are believed to be the first confirmed photographs of the Great Wall from space. And you can see them you can see it in photographs, but Hadfield said it's impossible to see the Great Wall from orbit because it follows the natural contours and colors of the land. So that's just an interesting side note. You cannot see the Great Wall of China from space unaided with the naked eye. What you can see, however, are the pyramids at Giza. The pyramids are apparently very obvious from space. And obviously, you can also see cities from orbit, especially at night when the lights are up. The astronauts from Apollo 12 reported seeing campfires in Africa. And again, Chris Hadfield, the space station astronaut, has mentioned you can actually see things, very straight lines. Obviously, straight lines don't occur very often at large scale in nature. I'm talking things higher than the molecular scale and things like that. So the very straight lines like roadways or railways can be seen very clearly from orbit. But no, apparently you cannot see the Great Wall of China from orbit. Just thought I'd clarify that. Of course, I don't have any first-hand experience of that, but we kind of got off topic. So, all right. Right about now, let's pretend we're in our 9th or 10th orbit. They would have had him being Gordon Cooper. They would have had Gordo in his rest period by now. He was actually not sleepy during the 9th orbit, but remember, in KSP, KSP, an orbit is much less time than it is in the real world. I think his orbital parameters were something like 88.5 minutes he spent every orbit, so that's an hour and a half, right? So if you're not sleepy now, are you going to be sleepy an hour and a half from now? I mean, they just didn't know. So they had him eat a meal. He had some roast beef and water, I think. And of course it was powdered, And he took some photographs, the famous photographs of the Himalayas during this flight, or during this part of his flight. Boy, I'm really not doing too well. And he later spent some time in orbits 10 through 13 resting, although I don't know if he ever actually slept. Might have to look that up. Anyway, yeah, he spent some time doing radiation experiments in orbit. He actually passed Wally Schirra's 7-orbit record while he was doing a Geiger counter experiment. He had something like 11 experiments to do, and I'm not going to talk about all of them. A lot of them are kind of technical and frankly boring for the viewer, but yeah, that's just kind of a mention of that. Okay, let's move along again. Again, we're not going to go through the 21 orbits. We're just going to kind of pretend. He did spend something like 34 hours in orbit. We're not going to make Jeb spend that much time in orbit because, I mean, it's just kind of orbit for us. All right, skipping ahead. We're now on our 19th orbit. Just follow along. In the 19th orbit, the first technical problems they experienced during the flight started to show up. They first found that there was a light on in the cabin, which they had a light when the capsule started to experience 0.05 G. That's a 20th of a G. It's enough to indicate that the spacecraft is re-entering. Obviously, they were concerned about this. This was deorbiting slightly early, so they were concerned what this was. Turned out it was a false indicator. They weren't actually deorbiting at this point, but it was enough to cause some concern on the ground. In the 20th orbit, though, Gordo lost all his altitude readings. He didn't have altitude control anymore. And either in the 20th or the 21st orbit, he lost all automatic control of the spacecraft, which of course caused a lot of commotion on the ground. And John Glenn, who was on one of the recovery ships, they had like 28 recovery ships and 171 aircraft because, due to the fact that this was in an inclined orbit, we're in an equatorial, but the real orbits were inclined at about 32.5 degrees from the equator. They had rescue ships and aircraft strung out which would cover most of the world, between 32 degrees above and 32 degrees below the equator. Now, John Glenn was on board one of these ships, and when Gordo lost his capsule stuff, let's look at another view of the spacecraft. When Gordo lost his spacecraft controls, Glenn actually helped him prepare a revised checklist for re-entry, which we're going to do in just a minute or two. They had to do a lot more of the tasks manually. They had to perform a manual checklist instead of the spacecraft doing a lot of these tasks on its own. So when the ship eventually was ready to be deorbited, Gordo actually had some markings on the window. He actually used the window and kept various constellations marked in the window, so he could, what is that? Oh, it's my dog. We don't want to see that. He had a bunch of various constellations marked their position on the window so he could be sure the spacecraft wasn't moving, and to keep it at like a 34-degree down angle, I think. Okay. Let's start our deorbit burn. We'll just pretend we were just talking to John Glenn, who just gave us a revised checklist. It's time to start our deorbit procedure, re-entry procedure. So we are going to shoot for, let's try and land just off that point. How about that? Actually, still a little conservative. I'm just trying to guess where this is. That's probably about right. Alright, so Glenn is going to give us a 10-second countdown to fire our booster, and because we don't have any atmospheric readings, everybody get out your wristwatches because we have to time this burn properly. So, remember, keep the constellations in view in the window, and let's start this in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, mark. Everybody timing. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, cut out. Okay, we're going to come up a little bit short, but that's alright. I was using the Earth values, and of course we don't have the same orbital parameters as Cooper did. Alright. Last sunrise on the Mercury Program. This game really is pretty. I mean, you have to agree with that. There's not another game I know of that has this kind of scope and beauty to it. I'm gonna time warp a little bit. And lag! I forgot about that. Let's look away from the planet. Good. I'm gonna solve the lines properly. Okay. What did I say, 34 degrees? Yeah, we're not going to be able to be that precise in 3D. Boy, I'm really not doing too hot. That was close. I really turn fine control on. That might help. Nope, not even a little bit. Yikes. Alright, well. It's enough to fiddle in with the nav ball. Well, and of course, that lot of difference it made anyway. Okay. We'll turn that off. Warp a little bit closer to the ground. Yet we are not going to land nearby. No big deal. Cooper did a little bit better than we did. He actually managed to land like 4 miles from the prime recovery ship. I think I said Shira did that, but that's actually this flight. Despite the lack of the automatic controls, they managed to land very, very close to the carrier Kearsarge, or Kearsarge. I don't know quite the right pronunciation of that. Okay, let's slow this down. We're going to get into our plasma sheath here. Okay. Which was, at that time, the most accurate landing of any spacecraft, at least in the American space flight program. Pretty good for burning with a wristwatch and some marks on your window. Those guys flew by the seat of their pants and they did what they had to do to get it done, which is pretty amazing. It's something the space programs have kind of lost today, but those guys were lucky that nothing worse happened. Oh, you know, I might want to ditch that. Yeah, that would be a good thing. We'll just pretend that didn't happen. Yeah, okay, we're like 15,000 miles away from where we're supposed to be. That was a total guess. Please don't correct me. I just made up a number. Okay. Well, okay, it's a splashdown anyway. That's a good start. I have never been one for perfectly precise landings in KSP. I don't really know how to do it. I know there's a way if you just set your altitude at a certain point from a certain orbit, but I've never been that much or that concerned about it. Alright, coming down, let's ditch that. And once again, ditches about as well as it usually does. Ooh. Plasma sheath. Connecting. There. Gotta shoot out about 10,000 meters. Oh, we didn't do too bad. Just moved those colons over one space to the right. Let's pretend it was a 56-hour flight instead of a 34.5-hour flight. Aha. We did okay. I mean, the world is scaled down to 10% anyway, right? Alright, so with the successful re-entry of Mercury-Atlas 9, the Mercury Program had fulfilled all of its goals. This was a big deal because, nothing like this had ever been done before. That's why they were doing it. We didn't know if we could complete all these goals. And remember, at this point, Kennedy had made his promise to get us to the moon by the end of the decade, which we didn't know if we could do. We didn't even know if men could survive a trip to the moon. We didn't know what we had to do to get there. So we had a gigantic engineering challenge ahead of us. But we got it done. Alright, we are slowing down quite a bit. It's a big chute for a little capsule. I usually consider myself lucky if I can get below 100 meters per second when the chute opens. Probably means I'm doing my re-entries too fast. Alright, good. Call that a day. So, they did not choose to fly Mercury-Atlas 10. Mercury-Atlas 9 was the last flight of the Mercury program. And it was successful. They did manage to fly a full-day mission, and they spent just over 21 orbits in space. At this point, some of the Mercury astronauts actually retired. John Glenn, of course, just recently flew, and by recently I mean the past 10 years, into space on the space shuttle. Can you imagine that? If you were a modern-day astronaut and you were asked to have John Glenn on your crew, that'd be pretty amazing. Of course, he was a U.S. Senator, too, which probably helped his case. Okay. Now, I don't know how many of the Mercury astronauts flew in Gemini. I'm going to have to look that up, and of course, we're going to continue posting pilot names and things like that. But I know for a fact that only 2 Mercury astronauts were still left flying by the time of Apollo, but we'll get to that in due course. Okay. Mercury-Atlas 9, signing off. No, I suppose I would have called it Phase 7. Alright, so Gordon Cooper, as an Air Force major, asked permission for an Air Force officer to board a Navy ship. Permission was granted, and the capsule was lifted onto the Kearsarge, where he blew his explosive hatch, much in the same way Wally Schirra had done before him. And with that, the Mercury program was complete. All of the mission goals were achieved, and it was time to move on to Gemini, which we will be doing very soon. This has been Real World Rockets, Episode 6, and this is James, signing off.